Okay, cool. Well, I'll just say hello to everybody that is going to watch and listen. Welcome to another installment of Groundswell with the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. My name is Jake Glaser, and today I have an amazing privilege and honor to speak with someone who's been an integral part of the progress, the innovation, the collaboration, really the integrated approach to so much of the success that we've experienced in HIV and AIDS. And really, I mean, integrated and collaborative is such a powerful word in this, and so it's such an honor to just have Dr. Laura Guay with me today. Laura, hello. Or do I call you doctor?
No, please. Nobody calls me doctor.
Okay, so we'll skip the formalities, but I mean, we've known each other for quite some time. And for those that don't know who you are, Dr. Guay has dedicated over 20 years of her career to curbing HIV infection in women and children, focusing on the African continent, and most notably in Uganda, where she completed her residency in Kampala. Dr. Guay is an expert in PMTCT. We'll spell it out for you. PMTCT is the acronym for Prevention of Mother-to-Child Transmission. One of the biggest hurdles that we were able to overcome in the fight to combat HIV and AIDS, towards an AIDS-free generation, and our dream of eradicating this disease once and for all. You being such an integral part of the interdisciplinary approach that came to us in the community of developing prevention of mother-child transmission, just that paradigm shift in thinking alone and the approach to see that and to find that perspective just absolutely blows my mind. But that's what fascinates me most about when I look at your career and just your involvement in that. What was that experience like for you?
It's so interesting that you asked, because I think at the 30 years of HIV discovery talk, I gave a talk one time, and I realized in mapping it out that my career was in many ways on the same timeline as HIV. If you look at sort of the big milestones, I was a medical student when HIV started to be identified. When the actual virus was identified, I graduated from medical school, and before then it was all the concern about what this was, and how do we avoid it, what's causing it. And I went right into my pediatric residency, and it was right when we were starting to learn, now that we knew there was what the virus was, that mothers could transmit to their babies, and I was dealing with that as a resident when we were starting to see babies come in with this terrible pneumonia and dying, and identifying them that their parents were positive. And so that sort of was in parallel. And so my desire to go, and I always had interest in going to Africa. I wanted to go to Africa after my PEDS residency. I didn't really think about, I wanted to go do HIV or AIDS in Africa. I just wanted to go to Africa. And it was just, again, the coincidental timing that when I finished my PEDS residency was right when we were really understanding the epidemiology and where the epidemic in kids was happening. And so this project came up, so I went. And so again, it was every step was sort of informed of, I feel like that the growth of my career and the path of what we learned about HIV were very much in parallel in many ways.
Wow.
So it was a challenge, but it also was a huge opportunity. I mean, I think the things where I had the privilege and the opportunity to do the work I do, to work with the people I worked with, was because it was all happening in real time with my career. So being sort of on the ground, and so that it sort of informed the process. Once I got involved, I clearly became what I wanted to do. But it was from being on the ground, going to Uganda at the time when nobody was there, and really, seeing the babies dying and meeting the mothers and really going through it, that it just drove the need to make this happen. And then things fell in place. So it's wow. It sort of demonstrates my age in many ways, because we talked about, I remember the days when, and that was really part of my life. So,
sure.
And it was very parallel with with the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, because when I graduated from my residency and moved to Africa, is when the foundation was founded. One of the first studies we did was funded when the results came out, the implementation. So I also feel like the growth of the foundation, the focus, what your mother started and how that grew. Also, all of these were happening sort of at the same time, and it made the perfect environment to really do some good work.
Going back to the space of the beginning of this, and no one knew what this was. There were symptoms, and we were treating symptoms, and then there were and stigma kind of grew from that, and we didn't really know how to battle this. But I can imagine, I mean, we all fear things that we don't know, and being a researcher and paralleling with, like you said, through your residency and your education, being confronted with something that really had this big question mark surrounding it, the courage to ask the difficult questions, to say we don't know, and what are the questions we need to ask to find out, to know where that has splintered off to, and how many other forms of medicine and research into virology and epidemiology, even all the way to today, and how it informed COVID response. And you know, it's just really fascinating, the ripple effect that took place there. And it's no surprise to me that you know, I sometimes have to pinch myself, and I have to be like, what are the chances that you and my mother and so many others and researchers and players in this game found their way into that space? But I think back to kind of what I started with is like, it's the integration and collaboration. You had to put yourself there.
Yeah.
The groundbreaking research into HIV and AIDS, even the medical practice and perspective then, was kind of unheard of, the collaborative approach.
Absolutely. At the speed with which things happened was unheard of.
I know that you were part of a very small group of researchers that were open to sharing this information and kind of reaching across the aisle and being a part of a discussion that kind of looked at more of like a macro, saying maybe we'd be willing to fail a little bit in order to get to the micro, to find that lightning in a bottle of PMTCT. I mean, as a perspective in your own life and where that's driven you, I mean, how much did that impact you in being a part of a collaborative experience like that?
Well, you know, I think there is a bit of when you're deep in it on the individual level, or taking in the clinic and working with patients and mothers and children, the urgency on the ground when you're there in it is such a different perspective than when you're looking at it from the outside. And again, sure. I remember going to meetings in the US where people were like, oh, this is no big deal. Like, you know, this is a very isolated part of the population. You know, this isn't really our concern. This is, you know, why are we spending so much effort? But when you're there in it, seeing it every day, seeing the what the women are going through, their life, not just in terms of this infection, but how that relates to women's empowerment and their ability to make decisions for themselves, the ability to take care of their children, access to care in these different settings. When you're there in it, when it is very new, those critical questions that have to be answered just come up to the surface so much easier, because you're there thinking, okay, you know, this is what I know. And again, when I first, I mean, here's again my age. I got to Uganda in 1988. So, you know, I'm sure many listeners weren't born then. And there was so little there that when you're having conversations that say we can't test people, we can't tell them that they have HIV infection because there's nothing we can do about it. Like, there's nothing we can do. So let's not talk about it. Let's not test people. They'll only get depressed. We don't have anything to offer. So let's not deal with it, was a very prevalent thought and discussion. Like, why would we subject people to this if we don't have anything to offer? And then, but when you're sitting there thinking like, this is really such a critical part of people's lives, you can't not do something. That's not an attitude that's going to drive it. Even if we, you know, we don't have a treatment yet, you know, identifying people, getting treatment for pneumonia early, looking at growth, like there's so many things that we need to be doing. So maybe we don't have the final answer yet, but we can't then say we don't do anything. And that forced in many ways the collaborative efforts, because it wasn't just one direction. It was, okay, how do we get women in terms of testing and accepted if they have partners and they can't disclose, and there's problems and the stigma issues. And so it all sort of came together in that we don't really know what to do. So we need to think about all the different ways that we could do it. And I think because there was a small group of people initially involved that had that experience, it made people come together very quickly to try to solve the problem, and in all the fronts. And similar to what you said, I think, if you think of technology and how it advanced because of HIV and what we had to learn with HIV, not just the immunology, which was very important, but even, PCR testing, like the ability to be able to detect, not to wait for babies, to wait 18 months. If you think about, we're testing antibodies and we don't know whether the baby's infected or not until they're 18 months old. And here you have a mother who knows she's positive and her baby's born. And we say, well, you know what? We can't even tell you whether the baby's infected or not. You have to wait for 18 months. That the game changer of trying to come up with ways to screen blood, ways to do all of this diagnostics, led to new diagnostics that are now used for all kinds of diseases. And the motivation was there because we had all of these gaps, but each one of those steps incrementally was a game changer in the path to HIV treatment, prevention, and PMTCT. So they really advanced the HIV world because it solved a need that was critical that we had to figure out. And particularly with your mother and the foundation early on saying, look, we need to fund people. We need scientists. We need to get people together to figure this out. Like, this is a problem and we need smart people to figure it out. So let's give them the resources and figure it out. And each step that we figured out identified more questions, and then we figured out more. But the whole field has benefited from that.
And it wasn't like one group was funded. Right. It was this multitude of organizations, of groups of researchers, of thought leaders, and thought-provoking ideas, as well as response to crisis and challenges that we were facing, that kind of like picked all these little puzzle pieces out of the ethos, and then it all kind of came together into creating this more complete picture of how we address something. There's a part of me that feels at some points that we're kind of at this point now in history where, not just with HIV, but with a lot of different social issues across the board, where the need to bring that collaborative mindset to more of a focus, to really highlight it in the sense of how are we bettering ourselves as individuals, asking those questions and confronting the challenges in ways kind of needs to be revisited. I mean, I see so much of the stigma around HIV and AIDS still existing. And it's not going to go away overnight, but we need to practice new ways of how we educate and how we disseminate information and how we communicate this experience.
I tell people now, even now when I'm trying to sort of teach or train people and say, we were sort of not making up as we go. We were trying things along the way. And I can tell you, I can share my experience with you to say, I can tell you all the things that I did that didn't work or that were wrong. Or, we've made every mistake in the book along the way. And the point is, like, then this is my role, is to help show you that so you don't make the same mistakes again. So it's like, yes, we were trying all kinds of things, and we learned, again, thinking about the integrative approaches, that you can't take care of HIV in isolation. And it's not just meaning the medical care of the person, but the medical infrastructure, the systems, the way, the counseling, the way health providers interact with patients. Again, early days of Uganda, it was very big. You come in, you sit down, they do their test, they listen, they do that, they give you a piece of paper, you walk away and it says 1 times 2, and that means you take this tablet twice a day. What you had, what was the diagnosis, what drugs you're on, what the discussion is about, how long. Just didn't happen. It was fast. There's not enough staff. We move very quickly, and that didn't work, and it shouldn't work, and it wasn't the right way. But until you had sort of some something to drive a change, then it doesn't happen. If you look at even the research infrastructure, and I think about, if I think now, I think one of the questions is, if I look back on, so where are we now compared to what was there, and
Sure.
was there any contribution I made to that role? If you look at the number of really bright, amazing researchers, clinicians, service delivery people, research units where top science is happening, these are in the places that where we went in terms of the epidemic, where there was just nothing there when we got there. And so it wasn't, again, just let's take care of patients. Again, with the COVID example, all the sequencing, getting these new variants, all happened in South Africa in a way where they were on top of everything. But that infrastructure was built because of the HIV infrastructure. So it was a bit of saying, okay, look, we've got capacity issues, we've got health systems issues, we've got the human rights issues. There's so many issues that this flagged or identified as problems that made the sort of the advocacy, the act of saying, like, we really need to fix this, not just because we have a person with HIV we need to care about, but this is wrong the way this is happening, and we need to address it. And so it allowed that sort of visibility of the vulnerabilities and the gaps. And it would be wrong to say, it was great and now we've fixed all the problems and, there's great health infrastructure, everybody has that. I mean, yes, we still have a way to go.
Sure.
Think back to where it was and where we are now. When I walk through the hospital in Malago Hospital now, and I look at where they are now compared to where they were in 1988 when I got there, it's unrecognizable. And so it's not all just, one focus, but things have moved so far. And I think that we've unfortunately, I think part of the challenge is we've sort of reached a bit of a plateau, and we've gotten to so far, and now we're sort of here, and we just can't. We need to figure out how to make that next step to reach where we need to be, and so there needs to be new blood, new administration. I always say to the young people, like, okay, we've taken it from here to here. I'm getting old. I need to retire. Like, you all need to fix the rest of, like, this is what's left. And there's still a lot of work to do. So we can't just rest. And I think one of the challenges in PMTCT, many of the world not on the ground think that we've already solved the problem. It's done. We don't need to pay any attention to it. But we still have 150,000 kids being born with HIV every year. Like, that's not acceptable. So how do we make sure we're not, sort of resting now and saying, phew, that we did a lot of work. We're so much better. Now we're done. We still have to have that motivation, and it's much harder when it's not sort of in the face of people every day to see that when you're there and you see the need, you really want to act. It's less visible now. No matter how we look at it, it's good that it's less visible, but it can't not be visible.
No, and I agree. But I do see that. It's the difference of are you going to treat the symptoms, or are you going to fix the problem?
Yep.
While evolution needs to continue and we need to pass that torch, we're still all in the same boat, rowing in the same direction. And and that's where I try to express so much to younger generation, because I mean, geez, I'm going to be 39 in October. It helps if I shave my beard, because then the grays go away.
You dye your roots.
I shed a few years, but it's not only pick up that torch, innovate, ask questions, confront these issues, look at the not just the symptoms, but fix the problem. But it's also how we collaboratively do this together, while young voices are so valuable, and historical voices and experienced voices of the profession, such as yours, such as leaders of industry, boards of directors, the leadership councils that be within this space, and opening up that dialogue to allow those young voices to come in and not just be a voice of a young person, but a driver in identifying and innovating kind of the new structure of how things can look moving forward. Looking at where we are now and into the future, I mean, from your perspective, do you think that we're still kind of talking about HIV kind of in its own bubble or on its own pedestal? And if so, do we need to find more innovative ways to include it in the collective experience of just general healthcare, of kind of the screening and process that we have to go through for like a physical, if I'm going to go play on like the baseball team at my high school?
Yeah. No, it's interesting because, you know, I teach a class at GW every year, and actually your buddy Ben Banks comes and talks, and we also
Love
have
it.
a young woman living with HIV who's 22, and they both present about what it's like to grow up with living with HIV, and they're very different stories. But the interesting part for both is that I do have students in my class who say, I've never met anybody with HIV. I didn't know anything about it. My guess is they've met lots of people with HIV. They just, as you mentioned, they don't advertise that they have HIV. Right. But the message to hear these stories and say, wow, I didn't really realize that you know, that there are people that live a long time with HIV, that you know, Ben can be married and have a daughter and have a, you know, a very, you know, a life that parallels my life, and yet they have HIV. So in some ways we can't not make sure it's on the table, because then people forget that it's something that's there, that there are still things we need to deal with. But I do agree that just this sort of isolated world, the vertical world of HIV, has evolved and is changing and needs to change more. And just to give you an example, you know, we talk a lot, even in Africa in our meetings, about, you know, what's the direction of HIV services and programs, and saying that, you know, the mindset now is this is a chronic disease, right? So so that HIV shouldn't be any different than any other chronic disease. It doesn't, it shouldn't have that sort of separate, it's over here, it's HIV chronic disease.
Like it's like a special experience.
Yeah, that all these, and it's good and bad, because there's a lot of resources, there's things going on, but it's like, okay, well, why isn't there a chronic disease clinic, and one day is HIV, and one day is syphilis, and I mean, sickle cell, and one day is diabetes, and it's, so it is that normalization in some ways of saying, you know what, we've converted, we really have converted from this really critical emergency, people are just dying, and now there are still really important issues, and it's an important infection and disease that needs to be addressed, but it's time to think about it in a different way. So we can't not talk about it, because then people don't know, and they don't realize all the things that's left to do. But we also have to then look at it and say, okay, you know, how do we make sure that this is like other infections, that it's not the exceptionalism of we have to do things really differently with HIV because it's HIV. I mean, there's other infectious diseases, and there's other non-infectious diseases that are lifelong, that require medication and adherence, might have stigma. And so it is a bit of trying to shift that in terms of saying, okay, even the resources and integration and the way the money goes, and, you know, as you do, activities follow the money, it really is, okay, how do we make the next stage of this be putting this in the context of all of the different issues? You know, we know now with aging and HIV infection, I mean, there are, you know, people who've lived for 50 years with HIV, or are in the process of dealing with age-related changes that we never addressed before, because we didn't have people that were 70 years old living with HIV. And so it's a shift that we have to come up with a way to manage, so we don't lose the impetus, the momentum, and the focus, yet we also don't make it isolated and vertical.
The draw that I take from you in your history in HIV and AIDS, and the parallel that you have both in your education and being able to have those tracks, you know, follow side by side and integrated into the foundation and that experience, to now talk about where we're headed and how we keep a conversation going.
I do think that I think it's the time where we do need to reach out to other fields where, you know, we've talked a lot about how HIV has driven the field. We've learned a lot, and other fields can take advantage of it. That's so true. But I think now, as we look at a more sort of, again, integrated chronic disease model, there are diseases that we should be learning from, that we probably don't reach out to learn from, in terms of, well, how do you manage to get somebody with sickle cell to take their disease, to take their antibiotic every single day, their whole life, whether they're 12
Sure.
or 25 or 40. How do you deal with diabetes and hypertension? So there are disease models that HIV now will parallel. So we have to be open to that, reaching out to learn from those as well. So it's a two-way street, not just a one direction. I think we've made good progress. It was interesting. I just came back from Croy last week, and several of the presentations in the plenary were people who were giving presentations, and they said, I've never been to an HIV meeting before. This is really interesting because, this isn't my group of people, but one was talking about aging, and it was a researcher on aging. What do we know about aging? What do we know about differential patterns and how some people age differently, and what influences it genetically, exposure-wise? And so we started with I'm an aging person, so I don't do HIV, but here's what I know about aging, and then here's how I think it relates. And then the same was dealing with hepatitis. And so it was just interesting to me that at this meeting now that it was started with people who came from places that said this was the first time, because they're not HIV people, they don't work in the HIV space, but now they've invited to a primary, really, very scientific HIV meeting to share the evidence that they have from their field to look at how that relates to HIV. And that's a big step and change. And I think that's really where we start to say, okay, it's a smaller world, but the world in general, we're facing a lot of the same issues. How do we make sure we're not reinventing the wheel, duplicating? How are we making sure we're learning from other fields, just like other fields learned from HIV along the way?
Yeah, I think, I couldn't have said it any better myself. And what's really powerful about that is it exists beyond just medicine. Bringing a then till now, right? We need to bring that collaborative nature back in innovative new ways. We saw how much impact and how incredible the strides were that we made from the 80s till now, and that was a part of that lightning in the bottle experience. And now it's I have these moments where I'm screaming for this breaking through the glass ceiling moment again, where you're going, how are we reapproaching it in an integrated way to say, even when you're recalling witnessing the physical space and how HIV was dealt with when you first visited Africa, of well, we don't have treatment, so we're just not even going to test you for it. We're just going to kind of shove it to the side, and you sit there and you look at how far that's evolved, even the language, the educational process, even the environment itself has changed. And that obviously needs to continue.
So aging used to be, old age and diseases that you get when you're old. But the the knowledge, the presentation about aging was about stress and inflammation and nutrition and exercise and interpersonal engagement of, people who are isolated at home versus, having that sort of relationship. And as he was talking about these, it's sort of this map of all the different components that feed into whether we age. We all age. So, do we age in a healthier?
How are you going to age?
Or, how you do it is again, it's all those pieces again. It's not you have hypertension, you take your meds. Yeah, that's true. But if you're stressing, you're not getting, it's all this component that incorporates all those pieces, just like we've evolved in terms of HIV, of saying it's not just saying, okay, you have HIV, take your drugs. It's all the other environmental pieces that are so important in terms of thriving with and managing the activities and succeeding, whether it's, again, the medical side, the individual side, the government side, the communities in which these activities are going on. And so I do think in many ways that the understanding in the medical world in general that none of these diseases are independent, and that if you don't address these other factors, they all have influences on how you can thrive with whatever disease it is that you have, or whatever aging process. All of this is incorporated, and so I think we've learned a lot. And again, it would be nice to say it's all HIV, but just in general, the evolution of what we know about life and how to lead productive lives has evolved, and they're all interwoven.
Sure. And I guess you could say it really is a relay race of
Yeah.
sorts, right? It's not solve a problem and it's done. It's solve a problem and pass on the knowledge and pass that baton to the next generation, because they're not gonna be without their own set of hurdles.
What's the next sign? What's the next innovation? What are the things that we know in terms of diagnostics, in terms of treatments, in terms of prevention? Our prevention portfolio is so much bigger than it was before. It's like use condoms or don't have sex. Like that was it.
Right.
But that
Yeah, totally.
really, very practical. And so I do think there will continue to be sort of evolution,
Totally.
where have our challenges been? The HIV vaccine world has just been filled with little steps forward, but giant steps back. The
Right.
trial was, and so, did we hope back then? And even, I did the first pediatric HIV vaccine studies in Uganda with neonates, probably 15 years ago, and we hoped that would lead to more, but it didn't. And so we still have areas that,
but you learn from it, right?
It evaded us. And there's a lot more work, and so there are. I have to be optimistic that there are still going to be game-changing discoveries or activities going forward, that we haven't sort of gotten to a place where the major things we've accomplished, and now we're just going to trickle in improvements, that we will have some major advances that are going to change the face.
Sure. It's a requirement. This needs to happen. I mean, we can't, if complacency with what we have so far and just being okay with that is the perspective, then we are going to hit a boiling over point, and we're going to erase a lot of the work that we've accomplished. And so, I mean, holistic is everything, right? It's a combination of, yes, do not stop the research, the medical space. We have to find ways to make the practice and process of remaining undetectable, of keeping our health in a pristine state, easier for us to access as patients. And that's not just HIV, right? It's like, I think you sit there and you can say undetectable is untransmittable, and if you take a pill every day, you're not going to transmit HIV. But there are also other sexually transmitted diseases that you don't want to live with, or you'd be better off, happier not having to deal with that, or your life would be a little easier in that sense. And so it is this holistic approach of taking it all into consideration, and then beyond that, or parallel to that, is the psychological component to it all of, I'm not willing to sit and just wait for the generations that kind of seeded and continued and perpetuated the stigma to just die off, for it to be a non-stigma driven space. We can uplift everybody in that process, and we all have opportunity to grow and to learn and to gain a new perspective, and kind of enlighten ourselves to new ideas and new practices. And so look, I mean, this has been an incredible conversation with you. It's been far too long.
Always nice. It's such a pleasure always to talk to you.
Thank you, Laura. And there's a quote that you have that's a part of our organization, and it's a huge part of your life, which is, when it comes to your career, I tell people, you just don't know. Something could come along and change your life, and for me, this was it. And I want everyone listening to really let that in, because we never know what's going to happen in our lives, and we never know when one interaction is going to create a paradigm shift and a pivot into a beautiful, prosperous, different future. And
I just wanted to go to Africa, and I just went to Africa, and
totally,
I am today because it just happened to be that particular project that got me involved. So I tell students that all the time: just whatever you do, learn something, right? And you never know when that's going to change your life. So
get involved in life and enjoy the ride, and be open to
learn, no matter where you are and what you're doing.
Totally.
For whatever you can, and grow.
And be open to learning from getting things wrong.
Yeah.
Right. It's okay to make mistakes. It doesn't define us. What defines us is what we do with those mistakes. Do we learn from them? Do we grow from them? Thank you, Laura. And thanks for sharing so much of your perspective, your career. And thank you for your truly tireless contribution to all of this. I would not be the person I am today without you and the community that you represent. And I think I can say that on behalf of so many other people in this world. And boy, do we have a lot to learn from you. So thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thanks very much. I'm not retiring yet. So.
That's what I like to hear. Yeah, definitely.